Today's World Insight. When China sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. How true for the COVID-19 epidemic. And a test for China-U.S. relations under the strain of a viral outbreak, in the words of a longtime U.S. diplomat on China.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We start with the latest on the novel coronavirus, also known as COVID-19. China has confirmed nearly 75,000 COVID-19 patients with more than 49,000 suspected cases. More than 2,100 people have died. The number of recovered cases is rising to almost 8 times the death toll. More confirmed cases were also reported in other countries around the world. Meanwhile, with almost the businesses suspended, factories still mainly closed, and people, some of them, are still being urged to stay at home. China's economic growth is hitting the bricks, some suggest, particularly in the first quarter. Many are worried about its broader impact on the global economy. Before we get down to a discussion with our panelists about that, take a look at this first.
When China sneezes, could the rest of the world catch the flu? So goes the old maxim on the Chinese economy's influence beyond its borders. Many are looking for clues about the extent of the impact on the global economy. Foreign businesses in China are taking a hit, as many staff still cannot come to work yet. Some of China's southeast neighbors are among the worst hit globally. Altogether, more than 150 COVID-19 cases have been confirmed in 6 ASEAN countries, with 1 death. As a major holiday destination for Chinese tourists, the region has suffered tremendously from a dramatic dive in holiday makers. Other industries are also struggling. Some European countries are having similar troubles. The Chinese make up 35% of the global consumers of luxury goods. Half of those purchases are made in China, the other half overseas, in places like France. A fall in Chinese tourists and a drop in output from production centers in China due to the epidemic are a drag on France's retail industries. Visitors from China are some of the big spenders in France, where high fashion has also taken a hit.
The outlook for the EU economy is subject to new downside risks. First and foremost, the outbreak and spread of the coronavirus. Its impact on public health, human lives, and economic activities remain uncertain.
The COVID-19 epidemic also means there is an extra hurdle for the global supply chain. In Latin America, where China is the second largest trading partner, the viral outbreak has disrupted large shipments to China. Perishable products have taken a much bigger hit. In the U.S., tech titans Apple's shares fell 2% and also dragged the stocks of its suppliers around the world. That, after the iPhone maker warned of lower sales in the current quarter due to constraints on iPhone production and Chinese demand. But many experts did say the epidemic strain on the economy will be short-lived like SARS in 2003. Although growth in the current quarter is seen to be low, China's economy is expected to pick up and even skyrocket after the epidemic. This will help boost the global economy as well.
For more on the impact of the coronavirus on global trade, we are joined on the phone in Beijing by He Weiwen, a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Many have witnessed the fact that many of our Chinese participants, in fact, of the discussion are actually joining us through phones because of the outbreak now going on in China. In Washington, D.C., we also have Anna Ashton, the Senior Director of Government Affairs of U.S.China Business Council. Last but not least, in London, Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to both of you, Ms. Ashton and Professor Begg, first about, where China is now after several weeks of coronavirus outbreak in this country. What does the rest of the world know now about the value of China in terms of global supply chain and interconnectedness? Ms. Ashton.
Well, of course, I don't think that it took the coronavirus for people to know that China is an incredibly important part of the global supply chain for almost everything you can think of. But maybe for those not paying particularly close attention, they know now. And if the virus continues to play out in such a way that it prevents full return to work for several more weeks, then I think that will be felt even more keenly, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's good to be reminded of the importance of the relationship and the interconnectedness of our economies.
I wonder whether that is one of those so-called silver linings of this very devastating situation of fighting a public health crisis. Having said that, though, Professor Begg, your take from the European perspective about the same issue.
Well, the first thing to say is that the supply chains are inevitably going to be disrupted, but they won't really have hit yet because things that have been in transit for a few weeks will still be arriving, and it's only in the current period that the production will have gone down in vital suppliers and will therefore start to affect the supply, the users of those supplies in the future. I think we can probably equate it a bit with the kinds of trade frictions that arise through what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, namely the attempts to impose tariffs and other trade restrictions. They too disrupt supply chains, so we are aware of the consequences. The only silver lining I can see is that it might push some companies in some markets for China to look for alternatives, and that may be a boost to them. So the silver lining is that China's grey sky, the cost of China's grey skies.
Interesting. Ms. Ashton, if I could just continue that point, we have seen, which I mentioned earlier in our programs earlier this week, AmCham Vietnam survey of its members. Suggesting, which is a sister organization to yours as well, suggesting that many of their members, American business certainly in Vietnam, find it very hard to restart their operation because many of the parts and components of their production actually is coming from China. So it seems that it's not just China-U.S., it's many other countries that we are all on this global supply chain. So what does this provide us with a second thought about whether we know well or not the real nature of this global supply chain worldwide? Not you, I guess, you know about that very well every day through your work, but really people that are making policies in different governments, people that are looking at media reports, people that are doing media reports. Do we really know that well the nature of the global supply chain?
Well, to be honest with you, I think none of us can truly grasp the myriad ways that there are interconnections between businesses in different parts of the world and the enormous potential for negative impacts for different industries and different companies. I think that that's something that will have surprises for all of us, even those of us who watch it closely, depending on how this plays out. We certainly have heard people suggest that this is, a reason for companies to consider greater diversification of their supply chains. I would say, companies were already considering that because of the tariffs and the trade war. And to a certain extent, that is a good thing, not just for U.S. companies or European companies, but for all companies to have, backup ways of ensuring that their supply chain remains operational. But at the same time, it's not going to change the fact that China's an enormous consumer market, and all of these companies also want to be able to sell to China. And even if the supply chain was not disrupted, sales would be disrupted right now because China is going through a major humanitarian crisis and doing its best to contend with that. So no matter how you slice it, China always remains important in this equation.
Mr. He, who is joining us on the phone here in Beijing, listening to your other colleagues, your thoughts about the same issues?
Well, I think certainly the COVID-19 has caught China surprised because we did not expect such a huge epidemic happening across the country. So we are taking shots. However, we are working at our best efforts, try to control the situation and resume production as soon as possible. The implication for the world economy is obvious because China accounts for 1/6 of the world economy. Any 1% drop in China's GDP means 1/6% drop in global GDP, and the more direct implication is interruption of global supply chain. For instance, in the automotive sector, Nissan of Japan and also Hyundai in South Korea suspended their home production for a short period because of the interruption of the parts and components supplied from China. And also Germany had 1/3 of their automotive output in China. The suspension of their factories in China cost 60 million euro for their profit per day. So it is obvious. On the other hand, not only the immediate implication, but also it creates uncertainty. The companies have to postpone their investment decisions, which will affect their future growth.
Well, we have seen, Mr. He, one after another, the pressures over the past few years, starting from the big protracted U.S.-China trade war now to another layer of difficulties as a result of this public health crisis. Do you think the Chinese economy and China's interaction with either Europe or the United States, two of China's largest business partners, will be able to endure this within, let's just say, still a few weeks to go, at least, if you look at the latest numbers?
Yeah, I think it's still too early to make any firm assessment for the future trade prospect with both the United States and Europe and other trading partners, because we have only more than 1 month of interruption. And how things will develop, it depends predominantly on the length and depth of the COVID-19.
Yeah.
We have already seen lights at the end of the tunnel because we have seen constant drop in the new cases and the new mortalities, and not only non-Hubei regions, but also in Hubei itself and Wuhan itself. So we hope this favorable trend will continue. Barring any rebound of new cases, we will see some basic control by next month. In that case, the affection will be short-lived.
Professor Begg, one of the things we do not know about public health crisis is we cannot predict. There are so many factors that are making it unpredictable. So as a result of this, there's discussion not just about China, but also the rest of the world. We have seen Japan, South Korea, and even some of the European countries. The number of COVID-19 confirmed cases, U.S. included too, have been up to a certain extent. We feel very sad about that news. But that could also mean, besides China, a big chunk of the global economy, there are other economies that are also very significant, are experiencing uncertainties too. Professor Begg.
Well, that's exactly right, and this is the trouble with trying to analyze something like an unknown virus, or it's now a known virus, but it's a novel virus that we don't quite know the significance of. It could escalate into a major global pandemic, Or it could be that the action that China has taken, plus the very severe restrictions that other countries are imposing in quarantining anybody who's seen to have the virus, that could nip it in the bud very quickly. So we're at that point of uncertainty of not knowing what the epidemiological aspect of this would be, and that therefore translates into not knowing what the eventual economic impact would be. If the spread from China is stopped now, and all the quarantine measures continue to work in the rest of the world, then the rest of the world will be only affected by the Chinese supply shock. But if it gets loose and turns into a global pandemic, then we can expect a serious hit to the global economy. Therefore, what China is doing to prevent the spread of the virus is vital for everybody.
Ms. Ashton, we've been hearing about stories from the Japanese cruise ship like Diamond Princess, and the people who have left the ship are being infected, and now they are going to different countries around the world. Some are having efficient quarantine measures, some may not necessarily be able to do so as a result of various reasons. So, Ms. Ashton, this really a different layer now we're talking about of uncertainties. How businesses like members of yours be able to make their decisions, particularly the first half of the year?
Sure. Well, you know, businesses like certainty very, very much. And, you know, when there is a situation where the environment is uncertain and there's a question as to how long that uncertainty will last, they tend to do things like postpone investments, postpone making major business decisions. And so I think we can expect that. You know, the reality is that even though there have been a lot of comparisons made to SARS, this is necessarily going to be different from SARS because China was, I think, the 6th largest economy in 2003. Now it's the 2nd. It's much more integrated with the rest of the world, and it's a very important economy, but also global trade is much more significant than it was in 2003. So it's very difficult to know exactly what to expect from all of this. It's a good test for, I think, our global ability to respond to future crises, and it's an opportunity for us all to sort of become more aware of the shortfalls right now that exist in our systems and in our planning, like the fact that there are 12 million Chinese medical professionals who need surgical grade masks every day, and there are only something like 600,000 made per day in the world. And unfortunately, China is sort of the test case for all of it. I don't envy China that position, but I think China's doing the best it can.
That is really an important layer of thought. Also to you, Mr. Beck, about that. I mean, earlier we've been thinking about, trade will be the pillar of the world. As long as we have trade, everything will be fine. We've been thinking, terrorism will be the biggest threat to the world. And geopolitics, as we have been discussing over the past 2 years, especially that between China and the United States. But now, you know, with one public health crisis that we have witnessed, this is already a huge challenge to the human society, almost incapable at this point still, whichever area you're talking about, whether it's academic research, whether it's about therapeutic treatment or vaccines, whether it's about academic coordination, whether it is about economic cooperation as a result of this stress test. Many areas are not giving very satisfying answers. So, Professor Begg, does this provide us with a second thought about how should we conduct our next step of planning for the world and also for our own economies?
Well, it pushes us to recognize what's already been said by Anna, that there is this strong degree of interconnectedness in our economies, and anything that arises as a kind of friction between our economies is going to disrupt to a far greater degree than we might have been used to in the past, when national economies were far more closed relative to the rest of the world. So it forces global governance to recognize that there are things to confront. Now, we've done this before. We had the financial crisis emanating from the Western countries in the late 2000s. In the end, that was at least alleviated by having a collective macroeconomic response. Now we can expect a collective biological response. There'll be a race on to get the vaccine. There will be races on to quadruple the number of surgical face masks that are being produced. All of these become business opportunities as well as impediments. So we shouldn't be too downbeat about it, even while recognizing the downside risks.
This, however, is happening at a time, if I could compare to 2003 when SARS broke out. This is a very different time of the world, because at that time, globalization was the key word. Now, Mr. He, if I could go to you about that question, globalization has been put into a question mark by some of the economies, at least the governments, and therefore global coordination efforts is under extreme stress test in this time's public health crisis. Mr. He, how do you see that, this stress test about the common goals, and as a result, its impact on the global trade?
I don't think there is a fundamental change of globalization current time from what when the SARS happened 17 years ago, because globalization is an economic law. Economic activities relates to the interests of all the countries. The deglobalization or anti-globalization is a political trend, policies or trade policies. They can affect globalization but not change that. And if we refer to SARS 17 years ago, people used to like to compare the current COVID-19 to SARS 17 years ago. But in my view, SARS is only a reference, it's no comparison, because COVID-19 is much, much more serious, either in dimension, scale, or implications than SARS. Because in SARS, we had altogether 5,700 cases. Now we have already 74,000. And in SARS, only Beijing, Guangzhou, two cities were restricted relatively strongly, and other cities were barely unaffected. And there was no factory closures or school closures or shops closures. So this is just as usual. So this is more serious, much more serious. But in the year 2003, the whole year, because the Q2 economy was affected, was 2% down. But the whole year of 2003, we saw a GDP growth of 10.1%, higher than 2002, which was 9.2%. And especially trade, which shot up by 37.1% for the whole year 2003. Of course, we cannot see that trend to this year.
Yeah.
A global trend in trade, we cannot see that prospect. But regarding GDP, I think if nothing unexpected happened in Q2, if we can control the COVID-19 by, say, April, we can expect a strong rebound starting from Q2 up to the second half. So the whole year performances would be similar.
All right. Well, you are very brave in giving your predictions, I have to say, Mr. He. But if I could bring up the other two panelists with us, I want to wrap up our conversation. Time is up. But before we go, from now until we see the lights at the end of the tunnel, how much effort and in what way shall we work together? Ms. Ashton, your thoughts first.
I think that there is cooperation going on every second in a variety of ways. I know a lot of our companies have worked very hard to get their operations back up and running if they are providing critical supplies, and to also find ways to assist with the relief efforts. And I can't speak for other companies out there, but I am certain that they're doing the same. I think that this should be a catalyst for cooperation, and history will provide this as a lesson on the importance of cooperation. I hope that it ends up being a good lesson. I hope it ends up being an example of successful cooperation and how important successful cooperation is. If it's not a good lesson, hopefully we'll still learn the lesson.
We hope it's a good lesson, and also it's a demonstration of cooperation and perseverance from all of us. Professor Beck, also your final thought.
Well, it's a test for the multilateral system. In recent programs, we've talked much more about the World Trade Organization. Now it's the World Health Organization, also a Geneva-based entity, which is in the front line. it's a test, as Anna said, for global cooperation. And what we should emphasize is there is a common good in all of this. Everybody has to subscribe to it, try to deal with it. And the last thing I'd say to you, Wei, is you be safe, and I hope the World Insight team avoids any kind of contacts.
Thank you so much, Professor Beck. I really appreciate all the three of you joining us and have this very important discussion. Ian Beck, Anna Ashton, and He Wei-wen with us on the phone. All the best, and be healthy as well to all of you and your family members. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. A test for China-U.S. relations under the strain of viral outbreak. In the words of a longtime U.S. diplomat on China, that interview right after this break. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. More U.S. products have a chance to be exempted from China's countermeasure tariffs a week after the Phase 1 trade deal took effect. On the flip side, the lingering tough U.S. policies on China are not doing either side a favor. Many believe that from Chinese perspective. That presents a big challenge for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, whose goal is to build constructive and durable relationships between the two nations. What's the best way forward? We invite now the NCUSR President, or National Committee on U.S.-China Relations President, Steve Mnuchin, who joined us in the New York City. Welcome to our program, Steve.
Good to be on your program. Sorry I can't see you.
I can see you clearly, and thank you for joining us on the early morning in New York. Let me ask you, by starting from the recent donation provided by the private sector of the U.S., your organization was one of those organizers of this campaign. Tell us more about that. At least the 2 million masks and many other different kinds of medical supplies too. How did that happen?
What's so striking about since the onset of the coronavirus in China is the outpouring of support from the American people and the American business community. Literally, the phone has been ringing off the hook. How can we help? How can we help the Chinese people? And what it reminds me is that the bonds between the Chinese people and the American people remain extremely strong. No matter what is going on between the two governments, the bonds between the people of China and the people of the United States remains so strong, and this outpouring of support, of money, of supplies, of free airplanes, and of many other things just show how strong the feelings are in the United States. It's not only the Chinese-American community. Obviously, the Chinese-American community is being very supportive, but these are you know, regular Caucasian Americans who are being supportive.
Yeah, but some here in China wonder whether it's big in words, small in actions, Steve.
Well, these are real actions. Goods are really being shipped. So it's important to look at that. It's important that these shipments, obviously they're not going to be huge in terms of China's entire need, but the symbolic importance of the American people standing with the Chinese people at this time of crisis is what should be emphasized, and it's what should be emphasized by the Chinese media and the American media. While the governments continue to have problems, I continue to hope that this people-to-people relationship will remain the ballast of the U.S.-China relationship. You know, I'm reminded, I think on your program, in fact, this past autumn, you know, people always say, how can you remain in the face of all of these, you ask me, in the face of all these problems in U.S.-China relations, how can you remain an optimist? And I point to 4 issues that I think will draw the people of China and the people of the United States together. I point to climate change. We need to cooperate on climate change to defeat this threat, this existential threat to the world. Economic crisis. If we have a repeat of 2008, we need the United States and China to work together. Terrorism, we need to work together. And the 4th thing I pointed out was pandemic. That if we have a pandemic, the people on each side are going to know we need to cooperate. Now, the results so far have been okay, not great. I think some comments by, Secretary Ross were, I think, not well thought out. I think the Chinese government should have allowed American experts immediately into China. Finally, it happened this past Friday. It should have happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. So the cooperation is okay, but it really should be a symbol to the peoples of both countries that we need to cooperate to confront these global issues.
I see. Just a footnote for you, Mr. Orleans. The Chinese side has been inviting the WHO team, which include experts coming from various countries. And as far as I know, there are American experts coming from 2 American entities that are in this expert team. Just to report to you about that. Having said that, though,
I was told by the U.S. government not till this past Friday did that occur. So it was quite some time before that happened. And transparency, trust, global trust is really critical. And it's important that we have transparency, accuracy, and we have exactly what you said, a multinational team in China to work with China's CDC, to work with the Chinese health authorities, to make sure the whole world understands what's going on.
Right. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is many here wonder why, at a time of a big crisis at home here in China, this time with the COVID-19 outbreak, the whole nation has been working so hard to fight this battle. The U.S., however, some point out, Mr. Orleans, on the other hand, particularly from the government side, have been doing one after another gesture that's not necessarily demonstrating the friendship of the U.S. side toward China, not even mention the humanitarian phase of the United States to another country. For example, right over the past few days, there has been scrapping of the status of a developing country about China. Well, you could argue whether that should be further discussed. Meanwhile, there has been naming Chinese media organizations as the so-called government entities, which is likely to put a lot of restrictions on Chinese media outlets in the U.S. Meanwhile, there has been indictment against Huawei, an issue that we have been discussing for a lot of occasions. I know, of course, very well that you do not represent the U.S. government, but some of the messages coming out of Washington, particularly from this administration, is also being read here by many Chinese in a very different light. Mr. Orleans, my question is not to let you to explain what the government policies are, but rather to let you help us to understand how can the civil society like yours, your organization, for example, and also your sister organizations and people who have been working on this relationship for so long, be able to carry on under the current circumstances, Mr. Orleans?
Well, I think the current circumstances make the role of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations as crucial as it's been in our 50-plus-year history. That it's really important that we educate, educate, and educate. We educate the American people, we educate the Chinese people, we educate American media, we educate Chinese media, we talk to the Chinese government, and we talk to the U.S. government. Obviously, these mixed messages that are being conveyed from the U.S. government suggest a divided opinion within the U.S. government as to what the policy should be. We saw President Trump tweet rather strongly that America, you must be able, and he meant Chinese companies, must be able to do business with the United States. So the previous day there had been discussion of whether GE jet engines could be sold to a Chinese company. And President Trump said, of course they should. So he kind of overruled those in the United States government who were looking to further restrict the kind of business that we can do with China. So the views in the U.S. government, the views in the think tank community, the views in the media, the views in the people are quite mixed. So it's important that the National Committee and others who kind of believe in constructive relations continue to educate. Where necessary, we criticize the U.S. government. Where necessary, we criticize the Chinese government. We must be an honest broker in this environment.
Having said that, though, we have seen the rise of xenophobia and racial profiling in some of the societies about China, Chinese people, or ethnic Chinese in those societies. Now, there are also cases inside the United States. I wouldn't mention here, not enough time, one by one on air now. But Mr. Orleans, you've been working on this relationship. You've been fighting against this kind of xenophobia, racial profiling for 4 and 5 decades. How much does it hurt you, I guess, in a way, that after 50 years of effort from the very beginning of the relationship, diplomatic relationship, I'm saying, not to even mention the long-time people-to-people relationship, that things like this still come back and haunt us all the time?
I think, as I said last time I was on your program, that in this environment, I'm often reminded of Martin Luther King's, in his final speech, he said, "When it's darkest, I can see the stars." So when I see these actions by the U.S. government that are solely based upon the ethnicity of an individual, whether it's a black person, a brown person, a Chinese person, I obviously will fight with everything I have left to oppose that. However, there are examples when there are Chinese in the United States who have violated U.S. law, and those prosecutions are well-founded. So the racial approach is obviously wrong, but when there is a law violation, it's incumbent upon the U.S. Department of Justice and others.
I'm talking about those cases. I'm talking about the xenophobia and racial profiling cases over the past few weeks when the epidemic broke out here in China. It's a time that everybody showed the humanitarian face, but not the xenophobia and racial profiling. I'm talking about these cases. Mr. Orleans, you know me very well. This is exactly what I meant.
You're seeing an outpouring of support for the Chinese people, from the American people, from the American business community. That, you know, the Huawei indictment, you know, I think the Department of Justice viewed that in its own silo. It doesn't see that as related to the coronavirus. If I were the Attorney General, would I have sought to make to expand that indictment last Friday? No, I wouldn't. I would be much more sensitive to it. But the U.S. government, sometimes like the Chinese government, each cabinet
I'm not talking about the government even, Mr. Orleans. I'm not even talking about the government. I'm talking about, for example, so-called sick man of Asia. That kind of title is being in some of the publications by the American media. I'm not saying one story will represent the whole picture of the American media, but certainly that shows the lack of sensitivity and lack even of the humanitarian face of certain people in your country. I'm not saying you're representing them. I'm not saying you should explain to us about them because you're not them. I'm just saying, for people like you, what does it take for you now to work on your side to try to promote this relationship when you have seen now more dark sides of this and ever more of it coming at a time of a crisis? This is my question, Mr. Orleans.
But you know, when there is, in the United States, when there is an action which is views as racist, the government cracked down. I mean, there was the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission. There seemed to be some evidence that taxi drivers weren't picking up Chinese because they were afraid they had the coronavirus. That's ridiculous. So what happened is the Taxi and Limousine Commission cracked down and said, if this happens, you must report it. There's a number, 311. You dial that and you report that a taxi driver has refused to pick you up because you're Asian. So what happens is when there is this racism that sometimes pops up, the people, the local governments, the state governments, they stand up against it. There are established institutions in the United States that oppose that kind of activity, and it remains the case. It's really the exception. Obviously, there is history in the United States that can be deeply disturbing. So when it rears its ugly head, people speak out. You know, we certainly speak out. The Committee of 100 speaks out. Other institutions that are devoted to kind of constructive U.S.-China relations and the protection of Asian Americans in the United States speak out. So there are institutions that speak out. It doesn't mean we step back. It means we actually step forward, and we're more vigorous in protecting the rights of Chinese Americans.
Before we go, we have less than a minute. you have always been quoting Chairman Mao in a way when you are talking to your Chinese friends about at difficult times, courage is what we need. Now, where do you seek your courage? And how does your interactions with your Chinese counterparts, in a way, be able to enrich your sources of courage? I hope, Mr. Orleans.
Well, clearly, my friends are mostly in voluntary quarantine throughout China. I'm talking to them daily on WeChat. My heart goes out to all of my friends throughout China, from Shenzhen in the south up to Harbin in the north, from Sanya to Chengdu. It's friends all over, and my heart, every morning I get up and they're literally hundreds of WeChats I've got with friends talking about what their lives are like these days. And what it does, it just inspires me to work harder for constructive U.S.-China relations, to when there are inaccuracies in the United States to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Orleans. I know you have a lot to share with us. We hope we'll have another opportunity to talk to one another on some of the specific improvement, I hope, that we can try to strike for.
Next time in person.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, sir. With the travel ban, we hope it will be lifted very soon. Thank you so much.
Hope it's lifted very soon, and I look forward to seeing you.
Yes. Stephen Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Really appreciate that, your time, particularly out of your very busy schedule. Bye for now. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook accounts as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Bye for now.